My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And we're so glad that you're joining us today as we kick off Black History Month with today's program, History at High Noon, North Carolina Patriots of Color in the Revolutionary War. A quick housekeeping item, we ask that you please type your questions for our guest speakers into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the talk, our adult programs intern will ask our speakers as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome our speakers today. Luke Alexander is a genealogist and community historian focusing on African American and Indigenous heritage in the Carolinas. He serves as vice president of the Benjamin and Edith Spaulding Descendants Foundation, Incorporated, engaged in philanthropic activities in his hometown. Farmers Union. Alexander is also an inducted member of the Sons of the American Revolution. Kevin Graham is a native of Brunswick County. He is a graduate of Elizabeth City State University. Graham is a proud descendant of several patriots, all freemen of color from Bladen and New Hanover counties. He also acts as president of the Lower Cape Fear chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, as the first African American to hold the position. Tyrone S. Goodwyn has spent his entire life visiting the Burgaw community where free members of the Jacobs first landed in North Carolina circa 1750s. In his teens, Goodwyn started interviewing his elders in Pender and the surrounding counties. Since his retirement, he has researched and published the stories of free people of color in southeastern North Carolina. So Tyrone, I believe you're going to lead us off. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Good afternoon, folks. There's two times that you're going to have to see me make the sausage, and this is one of them as I try to get the correct version of sharing. I know you can see part of the screen. I'm working on it. Stacy, how's that?
That looks great.
Okay, cool. So this is us. I'm going to start with our focus on our methodology. Then I'll hand over to Luke, who is going to broaden the scope and talk about Carolina details. This is us. And next to us, you see each one of us have listed our favorite patriot ancestor. We have many. And the three of us are DNA cousins. We're all Jacobs descended, as well as descended via other ways. This is my bona fides. I guess I should go to slideshow. And it got worse. Okay, we can't do that. So these are my bona fides. So what you should take away from this is I spend a lot of time paying dues to a lot of different organizations. And my shameless plug here is I am the vice president of the North Carolina Genealogy Society. Our spring conference is next month. So I would be very happy if you would go to ncgenealogy.org and become a member if you're not one already. And if you would like to join our spring conference, again, that's next month. That's in March. So let's look at the context of the war. In the 16 and 1700s, the Western European countries were fighting each other to take the American land. So our United States history is colored by the fact that English, hang on, I gotta get my, there you go, is colored by the fact that England beat the Dutch, beat the French, and beat the Spanish for North America, while Spain took South America. So our story, the American story, is English. We have to consciously remember the other crowns, the other countries, and the other people in order to get a full context of our own story, our own history. Now, remember that just part of the British colonies revolted against the mother country. The colonies now known as Canada remained loyal to England. And even here, not everyone was a patriot, but we won, freed ourselves from England. But who sided with the British and why and where they ended up after the war, those are important parts of the full American story. Now, this is Kevin's slide. You're going to see it later, and he's going to speak to it, but I preview it here to make the point. I want you to look at the numbers up top. Many men of color worked to create America. And as you note, they were overwhelmingly from Virginia and North Carolina. Why was that? That's what we're going to look at. This slide is supposed to have some motion that I can't show you because of the way I'm sharing, but those different labels are supposed to come in one at a time. But it talks about who were the patriots of color. They're invisible in the records, and by that I mean they're not labeled by color at all. They volunteered and fought exactly like their neighbors. They were 100% integrated. Now, later records, some of them were referred to as black or mulatto or Indian or African or musty. And on census records, again later, and many other documents, they were called free persons of color, meaning what? Meaning not white and not enslaved. So somebody's thinking, so you're telling me that thousands of free men of color were living in the South, fighting for liberty in the 1700s? And my response is, yep. And let me tell you how. Oh, this is going to be the worst. This is the worst one that you won't be able to see because of the way I shared it. We'll go through it. So at the start of the revolution, whiteness was only about 80 years old. Race and race-based enslavement in the 1770s was brand new. Remember what I said about the European countries fighting each other for the continent? In Europe and in here, they didn't have a concept of white because they didn't need it. Our, and by our, I mean English records, call men Dutch or Welsh or Spanish. People were identified only by the king they were fighting for. Other meant not my king, not color. But the colonies started to make difference between humans early, but it didn't solidify the social structure until much later. One example is 1640. 1642 indentured servants ran away. One was likely Angolan based on the time frame, and the other was definitely English. Recaptured, the English servant received the typical punishment. Some years were added to his indentured servitude. The Angolan was sentenced to life as a servant. So you see, already in 1640, Virginia was starting to give herself permission to treat African people more harshly. A key time was 1656. Now, we're an English colony. English law stated that a child followed the status of the father, and Christians could not be enslaved. So Elizabeth Key sued for her freedom, citing that she'd been baptized and her father was English, and she won. So by 1662, our English colonies reversed their home country's law. A child would follow the status of the mother, and Christians could be enslaved. So that meant that brown women's babies would be enslaved if she was. It put a price tag on her unborn eggs. And that's why if you do research, you look at last will and testaments, they literally say, to my daughter Mary, I give my Negro wench Hannah and her increase. That increase was her unborn. What this also meant is that the mixed race children of European indentured women were free. And that is how many of the old free families of color arose. So here's an example of you get to see when white came. In 1682, Virginia wanted to reserve citizenship to people that we would call white today, but the language didn't exist. So you look at the law, instead, the law had to awkwardly list the people who were not citizens, Negroes, Moors, mulattoes, Indians, because there was no word white. That concept didn't exist. But by 1691, that's the first time anywhere we see the concept of white in print. That law banished any white person from marrying non-white. So what does that mean? Why am I talking about that here? Because these people, the free people that fought in the revolution, they didn't run away from the prison of slavery, right? They walked while the prison was being built. They were free because their Angolan fathers had maneuvered well. They were free from the loins of their English mothers. They were free because they were original owners of the land. So that's how there got to be so doggone many of them as compared to what we would think. So remember Kevin's slide I talked about, and most of the free patriots were from North Carolina and Virginia. So let's talk about the relationship between those two colonies. Now, this is a bit selfish. This is not a scientific study that you're looking at, and it's not a complete inventory. If you can't, what this is the Virginia County map, and the colored text is family names, free people of color superimposed over it. I don't know what the resolution is for those of you who are watching, but that's what you're looking at. So everywhere you see color, that's where free families of color resided. These are just the surnames that the three of us track. These are people that dropped down into North Carolina and fed the North Carolina clan. So it's not everybody, but it still makes my point, and that is that free families of color were prevalent in the coastal plain of Virginia in the early 1700s, but they didn't stay there. And why didn't they stay there? Well, let's talk about it. Virginia was the first English colony, right? English arrived in 1607, Angola's in 1619. So by the 1700s, rich people had already taken all the land from the original people. Free people of color had little opportunity to acquire land to make a living on. Secondly, free people of color were overtaxed. They paid twice the taxes as their white neighbors. If the tax was $10, a white couple paid $10 because the husband was taxed. A couple of color paid $20 because the husband and the wife were taxed. And this double taxing of people of color was true across the South until the Civil War. So they can't get land to make a living, and they're double taxed. And Virginia county, county by county, holds many records of men of color sold as indentured servants to pay their tax bills. That was a very common thing. So as a result, in Virginia, free people of color were often like serfs. They were tied to someone else's land. The landowner would pay their taxes, and they lived on the land and worked for, little or nothing. So it's not, any stretch of the imagination why many of them heeded the call for the frontier of Carolina, because it was a frontier at that time, where native people's land was still being given away by the King of England, and the social structures were less rigid. Now, previous map was Virginia. This is North Carolina, even more selfish. This heat map is literally us. This is our people in Southeast North Carolina. What I'm trying to show is that there's these huge connected clans of free people in the Cape Fear region and southern and northern South Carolina. And then in green, you see there's also significant sets of free people of color in the northern region. So these are the two areas, this chunk down here to the south and then up at the border. That's the main areas where the free patriots came from. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about loyalists today because we're talking about we're talking about patriots. But what I will say is that by and large, the enslaved fought for the British because the British offered them freedom, and free men of color fought as patriots. One of the pillars of the revolution was what? High taxing of colonists. Well, men of color were paying double taxes, so that argument resonated with them. And England made good on her pledge. Despite George Washington's pressure, she refused to return the brown soldiers after the war. And so many of them ended up in Canada or in England or Sierra Leone. In fact, the founder of Sierra Leone, Thomas Peters, was an enslaved man who joined the British from where? Wilmington, North Carolina. Now, it's hard to find enslaved patriots because they didn't fight of their own volition. They were pawns, right? They were sent to war by their enslaver or taken to war with their enslaver. Ned Griffin is a good example, and we can only see him because he inserted himself into the court system. William Kitchen was a deserter, and rather than go to jail or go to war, he bought Ned Griffin to fight in his stead, promising to free him. And when the war was over, he sold him. So the General Assembly had to free Ned Griffin. So we're focusing on free men of color who are patriots, not because we like them any better or we think they're more worthy, but because they're easier to find, because those records exist. It's a matter of finding and interpreting records. Unfortunately, for enslaved men, we don't think those records exist. So now you're wondering, well, how? Why us? Why Tyrone, Kevin, and Luke? How have you found these? And you said the people are invisible. How did you find them? Because, and I just realized you aren't seeing the top of my slides. Here we go. What we do is we look at the standard Revolutionary War records, bounties, pension records, pension applications, published lists. We look at those. Again, the people aren't labeled as of color, but we know the names to look for because we know our surnames. So we find surnames, say Carter, and then we use other records using plain old genealogy research, use other records to find that person and find him on another record that documents him as a person of color. So we go back and forth between the Revolutionary War databases, between Paul Heinig's Free African American book, which is fantastic, between our own personal databases and standard genealogy work like censuses, tax lists, wills, etc. We go back and forth between all of those to pick these men out and document that they were of color. So now it's going to get a little worse for your eyes, so I'm going to change the way I present. Hold on. So I'm going to unshare first. Don't get scared. Can you guys see?
We
I'm
can
gonna
see
assume.
it. Yep.
Okay.
And it's super clear.
Good. Because it's going to get, this is what, I'm going to show you 4 slides that I do not expect you to read. But this is the roll call of the men of color from Southeast North Carolina. I'm using those as a sample, right? But I want you to, one, just see the numbers of rows that we're talking about, and then look to the left, how many of them are from Virginia. So this is slide 2. And there's more. See Virginia? And there's even more. So that's just our folks in Southeast North Carolina. So let's talk about it. There was 136 free men of color you were looking at. Among them, there's 68 surnames, and 58 of them have Virginia ancestry. So that's 43% of them were people whose families had migrated from Virginia. Like our Jacobs, they were second, third, fourth generation freedom fighters. Several other families had migrated from South Carolina, like the Brewingtons and the Freemans. When we look at these names, we can see that they were already established clans, right? There were 10 Carters, 8 Jacobs, and 2 Webbs. That was an extended family from Eastern Shore, Virginia, that was related before they left Eastern Shore in 1730s. And families like Artis, Bibby, Brewington, Carter, Chavis, Cumbo, Hardin, Jacobs, Manuel, Moore, Patrick, Peavy, Pettiford, Revel, Spellman, Sweat, all sent 3 or more men to war. So they fought just like everybody else. But the thing that I think is a little different is that you can see that they are all grouped together. This is already a clan of folks based on their legal and social status as freemen of color. Now, the next time that they would fight like this, the next time that they would fight integrated with white soldiers would be Vietnam. So I gave the scope on how we got there, who these people are, where they came from. And now Luke is going to take the story to deeper to exactly who was fighting in North Carolina and in South Carolina. Hit it, Luke.
All right, and let me and good afternoon, everybody. And let me pull up my slides. Just give me a second. All right, so I'm going to talk about a little bit more about sort of who these soldiers were. Who were the North Carolina Patriots of color in the Revolutionary War? Um, so let's start off about, we're primarily talking about African American and Indigenous American patriots. So what do we know about these gentlemen? In the popular culture, if you know anything at all, what you might know about soldiers of color in the Revolutionary War, what it may have came from the movie The Patriot, starring Mel Gibson. For those, and I know we got a lot of history buffs here, so for those who may have seen that movie, in the film, there is a fictional character named Occam who is portrayed. And Occam is portrayed as fighting in the Revolutionary War because Occam is enslaved, and his owner, his enslaver, is able to substitute Occam in his place to fight in the war. Now, and that is often the only portrayal that that we have seen of Black soldiers or Native American soldiers in the Revolutionary War. So, what's the truth to that? While there is some precedent for that case, and in particular, just to back up for a second, in that movie, The Patriot, Mel Gibson's character was also fictional, but it was based on a real life general in the war, Francis Marion, who was right over the border in South Carolina. But in reality, we know that there are more enslaved men that fought, but in terms of names that we have who fought for the Patriot cause, we can identify 3 men who were enslaved that fought for the Patriots. And so those are Richard Davis, Edward Griffin, and a man known as Cubitt, who had no last name given. In addition to him, there are at least 412 free men of color who are known to have served the Patriot forces in North Carolina. And we know that in this case, those are just the names that were recorded. There are many, many names that have gone unrecorded, or there are people that we know were living in areas of North Carolina that were of age to serve and may have indeed served with their local county militia. But for the most part, soldiers were only recorded in the muster rolls of the Continental Line for North Carolina if they served for the state-controlled militias. And there's evidence that there's a lot of soldiers that never got bumped up from the county level to be recorded at the state level. But among the things that we know about the Patriots of color who fought in the American Revolution in North Carolina, between the years 1776 to 1783, the span of the war, a total of 36,000 men from North Carolina fought for the Patriot forces. And out of those Patriot forces, we know that 400 plus of those men were men of color. In terms of who these men were, Tyrone gave an outline of discussing on how they inherited their freedom, or may have been given their freedom. But most recorded Patriots of color were freeborn. That means that they would have likely inherited status of freedom from their mothers or their grandmothers. There are also some cases of men who fought in the war who were manumitted or legally freed from enslavement early on in their lifetime, either prior to the war. And in one case, we have a man that fought and then he was freed from slavery after the war. Many of the Patriots of color who were free persons of color were landowners in communities of free persons of color. And several of those communities still exist today. I happen to be coming to you from one of those communities. My neighborhood of Farmers Union, North Carolina, down here in Columbus County, was originated with free persons of color in the decades before the Civil War was fought. The Revolutionary War was fought. Most freeborn Patriots of color had ancestral roots in Virginia, as Tyrone mentioned. Many of their families migrated to the Carolinas for better opportunities, and Patriots of color fought bravely in integrated units alongside white Patriot soldiers. There were no segregated units in the Revolutionary War. Of the soldiers that fought, I don't know if this screen is going to come through all the way for folks, but essentially just doing a list of a breakdown of the counties that existed at that time and how many folks out of each county were men of color that fought. Of the men of color that were recorded fighting in the war, the overwhelming or the largest portion of them happened to come from a couple of counties in the Northeast, a part of the state. Halifax County had the largest single number of Patriots of color. They had 54 recorded from Halifax. Right over the river in Northampton County, across the Roanoke River, they had 49 soldiers of color. So, and right there, you're close to 100 right in that area. In fact, let's see the next slide. If you include the areas of current day Halifax, Northampton, and Warren counties, you've got a total of 128 soldiers of color fighting out of that area. Now this slide I listed the names. This is going to be kind of small. I'll just highlight some of the surnames. You got surnames in this area like Archer and Artis and Bass and Chavis. You have Haycock and Manley and Newsome and Kersey, Taborn, Tan, Tony, Walden, Stewart, Scott, Roberts. So if you're not from that area, that might not mean much to you. If you're from that area, you're probably going to recognize some of those surnames I just called out. A lot of those senators that I called out are folks that you would find amongst today's the Haliwa Saponi Native American community up there in that area of Halifax and Warren counties. Many of their ancestors were among the folks that were listed as fighting in the war, along with other folks who were from the African American communities that are in that part of the state as well. Similarly, if you take as a whole the southeast portion of the state and the eastern coastal, portion of the states, like areas like down in New Bern and Craven County, etc., we've got at least 133 soldiers of color who fought in the east and the southeast. The big clusters here include there's a big cluster in Craven County amongst the group called the Harlow Patriots, which is a group of folks. A lot of the last names in that area include Spellman and Carter and Moore, etc. And specifically in the community of North Harlow, there is a Sons of the American Revolution chapter, the Isaac Carter chapter, that is dedicated to the 14 North Harlow Patriots who fought out of that community. The other big cluster of folks that fought in the war would be down in current day Robeson County and surrounding counties, folks that are connected with the Lumbee community in those areas. And I descend from one of those Lumbee Tuscarora Patriots, and I'll get to his story in a minute here. But in addition to that, we also have lists of what are called the Black Loyalists of North Carolina. These are mostly enslaved individuals that fought for the British cause during the war. The British early on in the war issued what is called a Lord Dunmore, who was a general a British general, issued what is called Lord Dunmore's Proclamation, which offered freedom to enslaved men who would fight for the British cause. There are at least 21 soldiers of color from North Carolina that fought for the British cause that were recorded after the war, immediately after the war, when the British evacuated the colonies after they had lost. And under the treaties that were signed at the time, they were allowed to take people out of the colonies who wanted to remain under British rule, and included among those were Black soldiers who fought within the Revolution. And Tyrone mentioned earlier one of the men in particular who was notable amongst that group was a man who was enslaved man who ran away from Wilmington to fight for the British, named Thomas Peters, who later, was evacuated. With many of these soldiers were evacuated first to Canada and lived there and have descendants particularly in Nova Scotia, Canada, even to this day. But amongst the group that were taken to Nova Scotia, there were soldiers who were then, and their families, who then immigrated to Africa and were placed in the British colony of Sierra Leone, which today is the Republic of Sierra Leone. And Thomas Peters, who started this journey from Wilmington, is considered one of the founders of that nation. And I should note right quick also, there is a cluster of soldiers from Robeson County who, during the war, actually traded sides. They fought for the British for a number of years during the war. And then near the tail end of the war, they flipped their allegiance and fought for the Patriots. These were soldiers under a captain named Micaiah Gainey, who had a South Carolina regiment, but included soldiers from right across the border in North Carolina, including some of the folks from the Lumbee community who fought with him for the British side until they changed allegiance and fought with the Patriots. However, there were other folks from Robeson County area who sided with the Patriots from day one and fought with them all along. And included in that number is my fourth great-grandfather, William Lowry. William Lowry was born into a free family of color who migrated to what was then called Drowning Creek. This is the area along the Lumbee River near Pembroke today, then Bladen County, now Robeson County. The Lowry family migrated to that area from the Roanoke River area of Edgecombe County, North Carolina, just prior to William's birth. William was the son of James Lowry and Celia Kersey Lowry. William's maternal grandfather, Celia Kersey's dad, Thomas Kersey, was a pensioned veteran of the French and Indian War. Thomas Kersey actually received a pension because he survived a scalping. In that French and Indian War, the colonists were fighting against the groups like the Cherokee, and Thomas Kersey was severely injured in that war and received a pension from the colonial legislature. Oral history states that William Lowry's maternal grandmother, Mary Pohagan Kersey, was an indigenous American, believed to be Tuscarora and would have originated in the Indian Woods area that is now Berkeley County, North Carolina. William Lowry, again, is my fourth great grandfather, as I stated. And this is a brief chart just showing his lineage, a genealogy lineage, showing, and what's of note to me in particular is we're talking about somebody who's born in 1758, and you see a mix of ethnicities in this early patriot ancestor already. Like he's coming from, in the maternal line, straight Native American ancestry. There's also some African American ancestry through the Kersey line. The Kerseys were originated with a Peter Kersey who was of African origin, who married an English woman named Anne, and then his son then married Thomas Kersey, then married a Native American woman. Their child that also married a Native American woman. So you see the mix of ethnicities in somebody, and this is kind of typical amongst many of these early patriots. They actually were very kind of ethnically diverse, even though we're going very early in the history of America here. So, excuse me. So during the war, my ancestor William Lowry served in the Bladen County Militia under Captain Robert Rowan. He served in the Continental Army 10th Regiment under Colonel Abraham Shepard. He served at least 3 years. He saw action at the Battle of Moores Creek, had a large scar on his arm and wrist that he received in the war, and had that scar throughout his lifetime. And he passed away in 1847, roughly at the age of 95. So, like I said, William Lowry, according to his pension application, the information provided there, places him as one of the soldiers that were at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. That battle this month is the 249th anniversary of that battle. The battle was fought February 27th, 1776. And we're looking forward to a big celebration next year for the 250th anniversary of the battle. But what is particularly significant about Moores Creek is that battle changed the course of the war in the Carolinas. It came early on in the war. It was only a year. The war was only a year into happening by that time. And the victory was so decisive against the British at that time that the British essentially left the Carolinas alone for the following 4 years. After this battle, you don't see major battles in North Carolina, North or South Carolina again until 1780. So, and this is an example of his pension stub. In his pension records, there are a number of witnesses that testified as to his service in the war. Many of the names kind of are an indication of what community that William Lowry came from, because you see a lot of names that, if you're familiar with the Lumbee Indian community today, you'll see several Oxendines. His son-in-law was a Jordan Oxendine. Of course, his wife is Lowry. There's Rebels. There's Locklear. There's Jones. There's names that are readily identifiable as being names connected to the Native American community in Robeson County, amongst the Lumbee and the Tuscarora communities there. And in my case in particular, there was additional buzz generated around William Lowry's service because William Lowry had a grandson, Henry Berry Lowry, who is notable in that area because William Berry Lowry and other members of his family led essentially an armed social justice campaign later on in the late 1860s and 1870s that generated a lot of notoriety within that area. So I speak about him just to give you a sense of one of the stories of soldiers that fought, and that these free men of color were, they fought to establish this country, and they also were fighting to establish better lives for themselves and their families, and to leave something behind. And with that, I'm going to toss it to my cousin and research partner, Kevin Graham, to elaborate a little more on that with some stories on his ancestors.
Hello. The fight for American independence through the eyes of African and Native American patriots. Like my cousin Tyrone mentioned earlier, there are over 900 free-born African and Native American descendants who served in the American Revolutionary War. Of those 900, 400 of those soldiers of color came from North Carolina. I descend my direct lineage back to at least 3 known patriots that actually served in the American Revolutionary War. Today, I will focus on my 3rd great-grandfather, Zachariah Jacobs Holmes. Zachariah Jacobs Holmes was born in New Hanover County, North Carolina, to Esther Jacobs. Zachariah saw 3 tours of duty in the American Revolutionary War, as well as he was captured and held prisoner of war multiple times. In 1836, Zachariah went before the United States government for his pension application. There, he gave information pertaining to his battles. Zachariah Jacobs' first tour of duty, he was drafted in 1778, and within months of being drafted, he would see battle in the state of Georgia on March the 3rd, 1779. Unfortunately, at that battle, the American Patriots were defeated by the British, and Zachariah made his escape back to North Carolina. Zachariah's second tour of duty, he was enlisted in October of 1780, and within 5 months, Zachariah would see battle at one of North Carolina's famous battles, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Here in this illustration, you will see the typical 3-line formation that General Nathaniel Greene came up with. Here will be a typical line. The typical militia or Revolutionary War Continental soldier was able to shoot 2 to 3 shots within a minute. General Greene asked his soldiers on the first line, which was the north line, to at least shoot 2 of those shots before they advanced back to the Virginia line. Going into battle, there were approximately 4,400 soldiers that General Greene had. Unfortunately, realizing his encirclement, General Greene told his soldiers to retreat. Below here is the summary of the battle tallies. On the American side, between 70 and 80 soldiers were killed, 183 wounded, and over 1,000 missing. Many of those soldiers missing was considered militia who left the battlefield. If you notice on the British side, the tally was much higher in dead and wounded. The British suffered over 93 dead and 413 wounded and 23 missing. Zachariah at that battle was actually severely wounded in the leg. And on his way, after he recovered from the hospital, Zachariah was on his way back home to what is now Columbus County, North Carolina. At the time, it was Bladen County, North Carolina. Unfortunately, on his way back home, he was captured by the Tory, and he was taken to Bladen County, North Carolina. This illustration here, you will notice in the green, where the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, present-day Greensboro. The red indicate the location where Zachariah was actually taken as a hostage. Zachariah was actually tied up for over 2 weeks. In the purple illustration, you actually notice this is the home of Zachariah Jacobs. Today, the present day county of Columbus was actually formed in 1808 from parts of Brunswick County and Bladen County. Zachariah took parole. He was told that he was actually would be hung if he took up arms against the British crown. Guess what Zachariah did? He enlisted for a third time. After the battle for Courthouse, this time, Zachariah was a part of a commando operation on the Ancestral River in Dorchester, South Carolina, in March of 1786. The commando operation was led by Major Michael Rudolph, as well as Officer Lieutenant Ballard Smith and Sergeant DeCone, as well as Zachariah, and right now 3 unknown patriots of color. What they attempted, what they actually did, they were on the Ancestral River, disguised as farmers and slaves, taking their vegetables to the Charleston market. Roughly at 10 p.m., a British rogue galley stopped them and questioned them. The team killed 4 of the soldiers on the British galley, captured the boat, and also captured the entire crew, those minus the ones that jumped overboard. This is an excellent book right here called Nothing But Blood and Slaughter, the American Revolutionary War in the Carolinas. It was written by Patrick O'Kelly. He also gives first-hand account of the tally, the soldiers that were on the galley. Here, the rogue galley had 2 12-pounders, 6 4-pounders, 2 3-pounders, and those guns, and also 8 swivel guns. Zachariah remained 15 miles outside of Charleston, South Carolina for the remainder of his 12-month enlistment, as well as 2 additional months. Life for a soldier after the American Revolutionary War. Many of these soldiers came back to their families. They were husbands, they were sons, they were fathers. Then in 1785, our state, the North Carolina legislators, implemented a policy branding these individuals. All of these individuals who were free, that Luke and Tyrone mentioned earlier, the whole community actually had to pay local fee to actually walk in public. Some of these former soldiers, my relatives, actually left the state and actually left the actual country. Today, many of our ancestors live in a community called Buxton, Canada. In Zachariah's lifetime, he saw 3 military tours. He was captured as a prisoner of war. He saw the development of America. Then, unfortunately, in 1835, those citizens' right to bear arms and also right to vote were actually taken from them. They were actually able to vote prior to the American Revolutionary War. The United States government promised land bounty to all of those veterans who served, but unfortunately, those patriots of color, the Native Americans and African Americans, did not get their share of land. What is the heir? An heir is a successor, the next in line, inherent beneficiary. In 1857, my third great grandmother, Sarah Jacobs, went in to attempt to get her bounty for her husband who served in the American Revolutionary War. And unfortunately, it wasn't given to her. On this slide right here, this is actually showing some of the land that was actually given to some of the universities here in the state of North Carolina. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And also, this is an excellent book. If you don't have it, go get it. It's The Black Experience in Revolutionary War, North Carolina, written by Jeffrey J. Crow. This actually shows a listing of acreage that was actually promised to these soldiers' family, but the family never received it. The first one, it shows Moses Berg. He was given 1,000 acres of land, but his descendants never received that land. North Carolina Highway Marker, what is this? In 1935, the North Carolina, jointly with the North Carolina Department of Transportation, which is one of the country's oldest highway marker program, and right now have over 1,600 markers statewide. Most of you seeing them on side of the road. They're silver and black in color. This is an example of one of the markers. This person here is John Chavis, born in 1763. He actually died in 1838. He was an African American teacher and preacher, and also a Revolutionary War veteran. He taught free blacks and also prominent white students. Actually, the governor of North Carolina children was taught by John Chavis. John Chavis is the first person of color from Revolutionary War America to receive such an honor. When Zachariah Jacobs was in South Carolina doing the skirmish on the Ancestral River and stayed there for 12 months, then an additional 2 months of his tour, he marched back to Wilmington, North Carolina. The week before Christmas of that year, he retired from the military. 2 months ago, exactly 242 years from the date, I received a call from the state of North Carolina telling me that Zachariah Jacobs Holmes of New Hanover County, Wilmington, North Carolina, will be honored and will receive a North Carolina highway marker. This marker will be installed in Wilmington, North Carolina this year. On October the 4th, 1847, my third great grandfather, Zachariah Jacobs, surrounded by his family, passed in New Hanover County, North Carolina. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, guys. Hi, I'm Allie, and I'm gonna be giving some questions to our panelists that came through the chat during our talk. So I think the best way to go about this is kind of address who is speaking when those questions were given, and if you guys want to chime in or anything, that's perfectly okay with me. So I guess we'll start with Mr. Goodwin's presentation and what questions were asked during his. So, someone's asking, what suggestions do you have to get more community members interested and engage in SAR and DAR?
Actually, I'm going to punt that to my two brothers who are actually members of the SAR.
Perfect. That's awesome.
Well, I would take that. They can reach out to me. I'm more than welcome to assist them. I know my cousin Luke as well. The journey for me started many years ago in research, doing my research and finding my relatives on census and census documents and other documents, and just applying for membership.
Yeah. Awesome. And I'm sure we can get some of that information sent out to whoever's asking and stuff. So I guess our next question is kind of talking about Mr. Goodwin's presentation and more of about the map of Virginia that shows the areas of free color people. They were wondering if they could get a copy of your map or how you want to go about that. We thought we would ask you just to see if you're willing to share that and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm hoping that you'll be able to share the three of us our email addresses. I'd be happy to give it to an individual. I want to, as I said, it's just our family. It's a very selfish Tyrone Goodwyn family map. So I want to label it that before I send it to somebody, because I don't want it to get legs and somebody say, Mr. Goodwyn said this is the final answer, because it's not the final answer. It's what I've accumulated.
Okay, perfect. And we'll also work with that to send out so people who are asking for that can shoot you guys an email. I guess the last question directed towards Mr. Goodwin is someone's asking if you would be able to repeat the description of how one became a free person of color in the 1700s, either from the mother's side or the father's side.
Sure. So when the colony starting with Virginia, flipped English law and said a child will follow the status of a mother, they did that to make sure that brown women's children were enslaved. But what that meant is that white didn't exist yet. What it meant is that English women's children were not enslaved. So many, before slavery was fully cooked, people were indentured. It was murky. It was nowhere near the 1800 slavery that we know. It was not roots at all. And so people who were not free, whether they were indentured or indentured for life, they all lived and worked together, whether they were Dutch, Spanish, whatever, right? And so many English indentured women had brown babies, and they were all free because that law had been flipped. So many of these families that you saw on Luke's slide, you saw on my side, come from English women.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for that description, really clarifying. So I guess we're going to move into Mr. Alexander's proportion of the questions. And anyone, again, feel free, anyone to answer. So I guess, Mr. Alexander, you kind of respond to this individual in the chat, but I just kind of wanted to bring it up so everyone maybe could get some clarification and stuff. So when you say 412 free men of color served in NC's Patriot forces, do you mean Southeastern free men of color, or is that including North Carolina or whatnot?
That's across the whole state.
Okay, across the whole state, perfect.
And like I mentioned too, that there certainly were more than that. That's just the number that were recorded and can be identified. It is likely that the actual number is a lot larger.
Right. Okay, perfect. And someone's also wondering if internet is critical to your ongoing research. I guess this could be for everybody, kind of general question. Can you estimate how much of the records you see are accessible only in non-virtual form? Kind of seeing what do digital archives serve for you guys versus actually going in person to the archives themselves.
I mean, luckily today there is a lot available online. Most of the things like the troop list and those kind of things you can find them online. You can find the pensions if that patriot first you had to live long enough. They didn't offer pensions until a lot of these guys were very late in life. So there's a bunch of a lot of soldiers who died long before the pensions were even available. But pensions are available online. So yeah, there's a lot of records that are available online. But we do not only rely on what's online. All of us have spent many hours at archives and libraries trying to chase this information down as well.
But we are digital nerds. We're that.
Yes. Yeah. Perfect. Love the mix right there. And I guess this is our last question addressed to Mr. Alexander. I guess this is referring back to your map that you had in your slideshow. Someone's asking the area of Richmond County that had folks from the area of is that present day Scotland County, or is that still Richmond County as a whole?
Well, kind of both. I mean, Scotland, for those who don't know, Scotland County, the current day Scotland County, was carved out of Richmond County back in the 1890s. So I think it's 1895. Prior to that date, the whole area of Scotland County was just the eastern portion of Richmond County. And then Richmond County was created back in the I forget the exact date, but somewhere in the late 1700s, it was carved out of Anson County. which was originally carved out of Bladen County, which was originally carved out of New Hanover County. But anyway, like, but in terms of Scotland County, yeah, some of the folks I have, in that list that I presented, I was going with the county boundaries as they existed at the time of the war.
Perfect. Yes. So, guess moving on to Mr. Graham now. Someone sent this description in and was asking a couple questions. So they said, since enslaved status was matrilineal and it was largely men who were offered freedom through this wartime affiliation, were there any avenues for enslaved women to become free during the war? And were these offers of freedom extended to women in any cases?
In our research, we haven't found any. And also keep in mind, all of our patron ancestors and many of the persons of color who we tracked down in North Carolina to actually fought outside of the loyalist cause were free men of color. So they were actually free before the Revolutionary War took part. So they weren't slaves.
Okay, perfect. And our next question is kind of referring back to your historical markers on the highways. Someone's asking, is there concern that the current state and federal governments will have the highway historical markers removed in any time, or is there any threat to that we see today?
I don't think so. Especially now the Revolutionary War marker persons like everyone that we spoke of, other than the loyalists. Without them, there wouldn't be individuals within this society even having the opportunity to even suggest removing highway markers. So I don't foresee it, and hopefully it won't happen.
Perfect. So these questions were kind of asked during our when we hopped on to start our question and proportion. So feel free for anyone to answer these as you want. So someone is asking, did these FMOC or their widows or children end up receiving pensions for the Revolutionary War service, or were they denied like the land grants? Whoever wants to take that can.
Yes. You want to hit that one?
Again, I mean, yes, we have soldiers of color and their families who receive pensions. We've also found evidence of soldiers of color who, or in the case that they might be deceased by the time that this was getting sorted out, their families should have received pensions, but those pensions were coerced away. They were maneuvered out of those pensions. Um, uh, we've seen evidence where pensions, the funds for pensions that were not sort of actualized actually were folded into the founding of the University of North Carolina. So we've seen cases where soldiers and their families should have been able to have that accumulation of wealth directed to their families, and they got directed in other places. So it's a bit of a mix, and also right after the war, economics were bad for everybody, and white and black soldiers often would sell their, like if they were entitled to a land grant or a land warrant, they would often sell that warrant for immediate cash, because we also would see, in particular with free men of color and their families, land was being offered out in Tennessee, which through the late 1700s, Tennessee was still considered a part of North Carolina. And families were not willing. There are cases of free men of color who took that offer and moved to Tennessee, but the vast majority of folks who were entitled under those rules to Tennessee land did not take the state up on that offer, because they were not interested in leaving their communities where they felt that they were safe, going to somewhere where they weren't sure what they were kind of stepping into. So
Perfect.
And I'll say that my ancestor, Primus Jacobs, who was the brother of Kevin's ancestor, Zachariah Jacobs, he like Zachariah received his pension, so did Primus Jacobs, my ancestor.
Awesome.
and my ancestor, William Lowry, the information I had came directly because his family received his pension. So
Perfect. And I think we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to have to turn it over back to Stacy. But again, I do want to reiterate that emails will most likely be sent out. So if you have any more lingering questions, I'm sure these gentlemen would be more than happy to converse with you guys. But someone's just wondering, where can we find a list of the identified patriots of color from North Carolina?
there are some websites that have, They don't break out the North Carolina soldiers, just by themselves, but there's some lists that are out there. FreeAfricanAmericans.com has a list that's available. And that's something internally we're working on in terms of the efforts that we're putting together around honoring these ancestors and these patriots. So look out for some stuff that we may have available soon. But for right now, that's probably your best first go-to source is freeafricanamericans.com. That's the website of the author Paul Hynek, who's done a lot of genealogy work on these families. And if you study anything with these families, that name will be familiar to you because a lot of those folks from this lineage are found on his website and in his books.
And the DAR have some the Forgotten Patriots, the Daughters of the American Revolution. DAR also.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to Stacy, guys. I appreciate your answers and everything, and it was a really great presentation. So, Stacy.
All right, thanks, Allie, and thank you so much, Tyrone, Luke, and Kevin, for taking time to be with us today and sharing all of your wonderful research about your ancestors. And this has just been really, really wonderful. So thank you guys so much.
So the invite. Most importantly, we had fun.
Good. I'm really glad to hear that. And thank you to all those of you who joined us today. We hope to see you at our next program, which is the next installment of our American Revolution lecture series featuring Mike Duncan. That is a ticketed event taking place on the evening of March 1st at 7 p.m. You can find out more information about the event as well as purchase tickets by heading over to our website, ncmuseumofhistory.org, and clicking on the upcoming events tab. In the meantime, we hope all of you have a wonderful afternoon and a great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.
And
Bye.
also be on the lookout. Be on the lookout this year for Zachariah Jacobs' highway marker to be unveiled in Wilmington, North Carolina. We're looking probably it will be the fall of this year.
Perfect.
Cool. Thank you guys. Have a lovely day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.